My name is Joanna Whitmore. I'm 68 years old. I was a nurse for 35 of them, the kind who stayed late, skipped lunch, and held the hands of strangers in their last breaths when no family came. I raised one son, Mason. I buried one husband, Bill. And I survived one tornado. Barely. It hit the house I'd lived in for over 4 decades, the same house where I'd cooked every meal, stitched every curtain, and buried every version of myself except this one. The walls cracked, the roof lifted. The last teacup Bill ever used flew out the kitchen window like it had wings. And when the sirens died down, I emerged from the crawl space with nothing but my purse, my wedding ring, and a few muddy photographs. But I didn't panic, because I had a plan. Or rather, a son. Mason had just bought a beautiful red brick home in Knoxville with his longtime girlfriend, Lena. I remembered the FaceTime tour they'd given me 2 months ago. Granite countertops, double oven, high ceilings with faux wood beams. The kind of place you whisper in. And I remembered something else, too. I'd wired him $620,000 from Bill's life insurance, my pension, and the emergency land fund we swore never to touch. I told Mason it was his, for a down payment, for a head start. All I asked was, put my name on the deed, just in case. That was all. No conditions, no contracts, just trust. So after the tornado, I gathered what little I had, borrowed a ride from a kind neighbor, and showed up at Mason's front step. I'll never forget the way he looked at me through the glass door. Surprised, like I was a ghost, or worse, a memory he wasn't ready for. He opened the door slowly. I smiled. I was still wearing Bill's old flannel shirt. My hands were shaking from the drive, but my heart, foolish, hopeful thing, thought he'd pull me in, say, "Mom, thank God you're safe. Come in instead." He looked back over his shoulder, and there she was. Lena, barefoot, manicured, holding a glass of red wine like it was part of her hand. Mason cleared his throat and said, "Hey, Mom. This is not really a good time," I blinked. The tornado. It leveled the house. I just need a place to stay for a bit." He shifted. "Right. Yeah, I heard. I'm really sorry, but Lena and we really value our privacy, and she's not comfortable having anyone else live here." Lena didn't say a word, just raised an eyebrow, like I'd shown up uninvited to a dinner party. "We just didn't agree to have you live here," she added eventually. "You know? Boundaries." I looked down at the welcome mat beneath my feet. It said, "This house runs on love and coffee." I had just paid for that house. I stood there, silent. My fingers brushed over the edge of my purse, the leather worn and soft from years of use. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't ask how. Privacy was more valuable than the woman who once worked double shifts to buy him inhalers when he was 10. I simply nodded, and I said, "Understood." I turned around, stepped back into the sunlight, and walked down the stone path I'd unknowingly funded. Inside my purse, behind a crumpled grocery list and an old peppermint, was a card I'd never thrown away. Ray Duvall. Duvall Holdings. He used to sign his name on my high school notebooks. I hadn't spoken to him in over 50 years, but I still remembered his number. He once told me, "If the world ever forgets you, Joe, call me." I won't. Nobody knew I still had his number. But that day, I called. My voice trembled more than I expected. "Ray? It's Joe." From forever ago, he didn't even pause. Just said, "Where are you?" 37 minutes later, a silver car pulled into the motel lot I'd wandered into. The door opened, and Ray stepped out in a navy suit, like the kind you only see on magazine covers. He took one look at me, my wind-blown hair, my mud-stained clothes, the heartbreak I didn't wear well, and said 3 words. "You're with me." That was all. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. And as I slid into the passenger seat of the car my son would have recognized from every local news feature, I looked back once. Just once. And I said to myself, that boy forgot what I gave him. But this man never did. The kitchen had always smelled of cinnamon and sage, especially in the early hours of Sunday, when the morning light filtered through the thin lace curtains and painted soft shadows on the tiled floor. That morning, though, the room was eerily still. No scent, no sound, only dust motes drifting through silence. The storm had been announced for days, but warnings tend to blur into background noise when you've lived through dozens before. Tornado season in Missouri teaches you to take cover, but also to carry on. I was making tea when the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a child shaking a snow globe. I remember the kettle beginning to whistle. I never got to pour it. I turned to the corner of the kitchen, my husband William's corner. A small table stood by the window, covered with a faded plaid cloth he'd always insisted on using for breakfast. On it sat the ceramic urn holding his ashes, flanked by a photo from our 40th anniversary and a little wooden box that kept his cufflinks and an old army badge. I dusted that corner every morning. That morning, I reached out and straightened the photo. My hand trembled as I whispered, "You'd hate this wind, Will." The sirens wailed. I grabbed only one thing before heading to the storm cellar, the handkerchief with his initials embroidered in deep navy thread, J.W. It had once tucked neatly in his coat pocket every Sunday, right after shaving. The cotton was worn thin now, soft like the inside of rose petals, and for a second, clutching it in the dim stairwell, I could almost hear his footsteps on the porch again. The ground shook. Thunder cracked like a rifle overhead. I sat in the cellar, huddled against the concrete wall, listening to the house moan above me. Each creak felt like bone snapping. It wasn't just wood and plaster. It was years of birthdays, late-night dancing, whispered apologies, and long, quiet mornings. All of it groaning under pressure. Then the silence came. Not peace, just that strange hollow pause after destruction. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. An hour? When I finally opened the cellar door, sunlight poured in, but not through the window, through the roof. The ceiling was gone. Gone. Ripped clean off like the lid of a soup can. I stood at the threshold, eyes blinking in the hard light, adjusting to a world that had changed shape. The kitchen was no longer a room. It was a skeleton. Cabinet doors flung open like broken wings, a chair on its side. Flour spilled across the tiles like snow. And the kettle, still on the stove, though the stove now stood crooked and exposed. I stepped outside barefoot. The lawn had vanished beneath splinters, roof tiles, leaves. My rosebush, dead. My neighbor's shed, gone. But there, just a few feet away in the wreckage, I spotted something glinting. A picture frame, then a familiar cotton sleeve, a blue nightgown, and finally, the small orange bottle of William's blood pressure medication, which I hadn't had the heart to throw away. I sat down right there on the muddy floor, holding those 3 things in my lap, like relics from another life. A photo of our honeymoon in Charleston, my old silk nightgown with a rip on the shoulder, and the bottle that used to rattle on the bathroom sink every morning at 7:15. I wasn't crying. Not yet. I just stared at the sky through where the roof once was. The ceiling's gone, I thought. But the real loss didn't happen above me. It happened below, where I sat in that cellar and remembered a life that's no longer waiting upstairs. That thought pierced deeper than any gust of wind, because for the first time since William passed, I realized something. The storm didn't destroy my home. It simply revealed what had already been hollowed out by time. Glenda's old Buick still smelled faintly of peppermint and mothballs. I sat in the passenger seat, holding my silence like a fragile relic, watching the familiar Tennessee countryside blur past the window. The radio hummed softly, some old Patsy Cline tune, but it didn't reach me. My mind was elsewhere, trapped between what was lost and what I dared to hope for. Glenda was one of the few people left who knew me before the gray in my hair took over. We met at church potlucks and school functions decades ago, before our husbands passed. Hers from a stroke, mine from lung cancer. Since then, she'd become my quiet companion in widowhood. And when the tornado took my house, she was the one who pulled into my driveway, her eyes wide with concern, hands steady on the steering wheel. Now she glanced over at me and said, "You sure you don't want to call Mason before we get there?" I shook my head, lips pressed tight. "He's probably busy." Glenda didn't respond right away. She knew me too well to push, but not well enough to stay silent. "Joanna, maybe it's time. Maybe he needs to hear from you too." I looked down at the small overnight bag on my lap, one I'd packed with trembling fingers and a breaking heart. Inside was the folded letter Mason had written me when he was 12 years old, crayon handwriting on ruled paper. "One day I'll build you the biggest house, Mama, with a garden just for your roses, when I'm rich. Love, Mason." I used to keep it in my Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs. But today, it was folded neatly in my bag, like an anchor I didn't know if I should drop or cling to. "I don't want to make him feel obligated," I said. "He's got a wife now, a baby on the way. The last thing he needs is me showing up with a box of memories and a broken roof." Glenda's hands tightened on the wheel. "You're his mother, Joanna. And from what I remember, you gave up a lot for that boy." I didn't answer. Instead, I watched a red barn vanish behind a line of trees. The sky was overcast, the way it gets before a summer storm, heavy and expectant. She didn't know, not the full story. Not how, after Robert died, I'd sold the acre of land he loved most, the one with the pear tree and the little creek running through it. That land meant everything to him. But Mason had come to me, eyes full of fire and dreams. He had a business plan and a baby on the way, and said if he could just get his foot in the door, I'd handed him everything I had. $620,000, the proceeds from the land sale, my savings, and Robert's old retirement account. I didn't ask for much in return, just that my name stayed on the deed to the house. "Just in case," I'd said, smiling. He'd nodded, kissed my forehead, and promised I'd always have a place. That was 3 years ago, and since then I hadn't stepped foot in that house. It wasn't that he'd shut me out. Not exactly. It was the polite distance, the vague replies, the missed calls, the way his wife, Candace, always smiled too wide but never quite met my eyes. Glenda pulled into a rest stop just past the county line. "We've got an hour or so before Knoxville," she said. "Need anything?" I nodded, needing more than I could say. As she walked toward the vending machines, I stayed in the car, watching a young mother chase after her toddler across the grassy picnic area. Her laugh rang out, bright and untamed. I touched the envelope in my bag, the letter soft from years of unfolding. My fingers drifted lower, brushing against another paper, something more recent. A photocopy of the full house deed. My name still on it, in legal print, right next to his. Room for roses, he'd promised, but I hadn't seen a single bloom. The car door opened. Glenda returned with 2 bottles of water and a pack of shortbread cookies. She handed me one and sat down with a sigh. "You ever think maybe this is the moment he needs to remember?" she asked, her voice gentle. I met her gaze. "What if I've become a burden, Glenda?" She smiled sadly. then let him prove otherwise. Or not. Either way, you'll know I turned my eyes back to the road ahead, toward Knoxville, toward whatever version of my son I might find waiting. I didn't know what I'd say. I didn't even know if I'd be welcome. But I knew one thing for sure. Today, for the first time in a long while, I needed my son. And that was enough to keep driving. Glenda's car slowed in front of Mason's house. No, their house. A neat two-story on the edge of a manicured cul-de-sac with beige siding and white shutters. Everything about it looked curated, sterilized, like something from a brochure titled Suburban Perfection. I remembered when this land was nothing but red clay and saplings. Mason had sent me a photo the day they poured the foundation. I'd printed it out and pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a barn. As we pulled up, I reached for the satin scarf around my neck, tugging at once to hide the frayed collar of my blouse. I'd worn this shirt on the day Mason graduated. He never noticed then either. Before Glenda even shifted into park, the front door swung open. Lena stood there, blonde, barefoot, holding an herbal tea in one hand and a phone in the other. Her face registered me like an unexpected package, unwelcomed, inconvenient. "Joanna?" she said, not moving. "You didn't call." I managed a polite smile. "Hello, Lena." "I wasn't sure I'd have signal. Thought I'd come straight here." Her mouth didn't lift, but her eyes did narrow. "Mason's just—" She turned and raised her voice inside. "Mason!" Glenda touched my arm. "You sure about this?" I nodded once. "Thank you for the ride." Mason appeared a few seconds later, stepping around Lena like he'd just woken from a nap. He was in sweatpants, holding a tablet under his arm. When he saw me, his posture stiffened, like something about me reminded him of an overdue task. "Mom," he said. "Wow, you're here." The awkward pause dragged. He scratched the back of his neck. Are you okay? Is the house—" He trailed off. "It's gone," I said softly. He winced. "I'm so sorry." Lena crossed her arms. "Why didn't you call first, Mason?" Mason glanced at her, then back at me. We weren't expecting company. And Lena feels a bit uncomfortable with guests." There it was. The sentence that didn't even try to hide its message. Guests. I wasn't family. I was a variable, a wrinkle in their curated life. "Of course," I said. My voice was too calm even for me. "I understand. We value our privacy here," he added, stepping out onto the porch now, lowering his voice like he thought I couldn't hear. "You know how routines are important for the kids. And Lena's been anxious lately. It's not personal, but it was." Lena hadn't moved. She still stood at the threshold like a guardian of the temple. No invite, no gesture. Mason looked at me again, that old boyish softness trying to peek through. The same look he gave when he scraped his knees and needed my bandages. "Maybe," he began slowly, "maybe it's best if you stay at a motel for now. Just until insurance figures things out. It might be more comfortable for everyone. I'd be happy to cover it." I felt Glenda shift uncomfortably behind me. A part of me wanted to turn and walk back to her car, but something rooted me to the ground. Perhaps it was memory, or disappointment turned heavy like lead. A motel. The woman who held him through pneumonia, buried his father, sold her land to give him a future, should go stay in a motel. "I see," I said. He looked relieved. That was the worst part. He actually looked relieved that I wasn't arguing. Lena took a sip of her tea, eyes unblinking. "I'll be in touch," I said, offering him the briefest nod. "Take care of your family, Mason." I turned then, slow and deliberate. Each step down the path pressed into my ribs like gravel. The air was cooler now, Or maybe that was just me, the wind cutting through my cardigan, straight through bone. I heard no footsteps behind me. No, "Wait, Mom," no apology, just the quiet click of a front door closing. Back in Glenda's car, I sat silently as she pulled away. "Want me to drive to the motel?" she asked. I looked ahead. The sun was dipping low behind the hills. A dull orange haze covered the street, the same street Mason had once raced down barefoot, holding a paper kite he'd built from my good wrapping paper. "No," I said finally. "I'd like to see something first." She glanced over. "What's that?" I stared straight ahead. The courthouse. I sat in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart on the edge of Knoxville, Tennessee. The kind where the neon lights buzz just a little louder than they should, and the air smells faintly of fried food, stale coffee, and forgotten things. My sedan, once my grocery runner, church ride, and garden hauler, was now my bedroom. I reclined the seat back slightly, careful not to tip too far or hit my bad hip. The windows fogged just enough to blur the world outside, giving me a strange sort of privacy. My coat, too thin for this September night, was draped over me like a poor man's blanket. I pulled it tighter, more for comfort than warmth. From the passenger seat, I picked up the brown paper bag I had grabbed before leaving Glenda's. Inside, the sandwich from lunch, ham, a smear of mustard, a heel of bread, dry, tough. I ate it slowly anyway, like it was the last supper of a woman who didn't know what tomorrow held. My stomach turned, not from the sandwich, but from the ache of everything else. I glanced at my purse and opened it. Not for money. I knew exactly what was in there. $23 in cash. A debit card tied to an account I hadn't dared check since last week. A photo of Mason at age 7 and the card. That old business card. I pulled it out carefully, like it might crumble. Joanna Whitmore, freelance floral designer, Knoxville area. My name in elegant script, printed on cream cardstock that had yellowed with time. One corner was torn. The ink on my phone number had bled from what must have been years of humidity. That little business, back when my hands were younger and strong. Back when I filled rooms with peonies and baby's breath. When people paid me to bring beauty into their lives. It was the last time I had a name that wasn't attached to someone else. Not Mason's mom. Not Paul's widow. Just Joanna. I held the card to my chest. Something about it grounded me, like proof that I'd existed before the house, before Lena, before the tornado. That I had once built something, maybe small, but mine. Then the thoughts crept in, as they always did, when the world went quiet. 68 homeless. No forwarding address. No job. No plans. My retirement had disappeared the day I transferred the $620,000 from the sale of Paul's land into Mason's joint account. "For your future, sweetheart," I had said. I only asked him to keep my name on the deed. Just in case. In case never came. Until now. I looked at my reflection in the side window, blurred, tired. I didn't recognize her. A gust of wind shook the car lightly, and I looked up at the rows of dim security lights overhead. An old man was walking his shopping cart slowly across the lot. Maybe his car was out there too. Maybe I wasn't the only one nesting in metal tonight. I clutched the card again. Glenda had said, "Why not call Mason?" But I had. He didn't say no. He just said, "Try the motel." He didn't not welcome me. He just didn't want me. And that's worse. A mother knows when she's been tolerated, not loved. And standing on his porch, next to a wife who looked at me like I was a stain on her rug, it was like watching the door to my life quietly click shut. I whispered into the empty car. I never asked for much. Silence. I took a shaky breath. My thumb traced the edges of the card again. Joanna Whitmore, I said softly. No house, no map, but I still have my memory. And my name. The phone was in the console. I picked it up, stared at it. One name blinked in the dim light, a number I hadn't dialed in over 30 years. I had no idea if it even still worked, or if he'd remember me, or, worse, if he did. I whispered the question out loud, maybe just to hear it in the air. What's the worst that could happen? He doesn't pick up? He's forgotten? He says no? I've already lost everything else. I sat alone in the Walmart parking lot, the glow of the overhead lights turning my windshield into a dull mirror. My reflection stared back, wrinkled, worn, and older than I remembered feeling. The empty sandwich wrapper sat in the passenger seat like a cruel joke. It had been hours since I left Mason's driveway, and no matter how many times I replayed his words, "We value our privacy," they never hurt less. My hands fumbled through my purse again, instinctively searching for something familiar. And then I found it. The card. It was soft now, almost like cloth from decades of wear. The corners curled, one edge torn. The ink, once bold, had faded into a ghost of its former self. But I could still read the name, Raymond Ellis, independent contractor. Below it, a number, a landline once, now a cell. I stared at it until my eyes stung. Then I whispered aloud, Joanna Whitmore, 68 years old, no home, no plan, but still remembers a phone number from 1972. I didn't even know if he still used it. I didn't know if he was alive, but I knew that the silence surrounding me was heavier than any possible rejection. So I unlocked my old flip phone, hands trembling. My breath caught in my throat as I typed the number, each digit bringing back the warmth of 17-year-old summer skin, sweet tea, and grass stains on my skirt. I could almost feel the heat of that July evening, the one where Ray leaned in under the bleachers, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and promised, I'll come back when I've got something real to give you. He never did. Life got in the way. I married a kind man. Ray vanished into dust. But in this moment, I wasn't a grieving widow or a forgotten mother. I was just a girl pressing the green call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I squeezed my eyes shut. Hello? A voice cracked through the speaker. I froze. Ray? I whispered. This is Joanna. There was silence, a long one. So long I thought he might hang up. But then, in a voice deeper now, richer but unmistakably his, he said the 3 words that crumbled every defense I'd built since Tom died. Where are you? Not how are you? Not what do you want? Not even why now? Just where? As if my location was all that mattered. As if nothing else, years, pain, distance, could stand between his voice and my presence. I couldn't speak. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat rising like a tide I couldn't stop. I'm in my car, I choked, outside a Walmart in Plainview. Another pause. Stay there, he said. I'll be there in 2 hours. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I ended the call and lowered the phone to my lap. My chest heaved, once, quietly, then again. And then it all broke. Tears I didn't know I still had poured out of me like a dam that had cracked clean down the middle. My shoulders shook. My palms clenched the steering wheel. I sobbed so hard my throat burned. And in the stillness of that parking lot, under the yellow buzz of flickering lamps, I cried for the first time since Tom's funeral 8 years ago. Not because I was lost, but because, for the first time in a very long time, someone wanted to find me. The next morning, I was still sitting in the Walmart parking lot, pretending like I had somewhere to be. The sandwich was gone. My throat ached from dry crying. I hadn't slept, just stared out through the foggy windshield, listening to the buzzing streetlight overhead. Then, at 7:12 a.m., a black Lexus slowly pulled in and stopped right beside me. At first, I thought it was security. But then the door opened, and Ray stepped out. Gray hair, same tall frame, slower steps now. But the way he moved, calm, deliberate, kind, hadn't changed. Not since 1973. He didn't rush, just walked around to my door and gently tapped on the window. I lowered it halfway. He looked at me like he was finishing a sentence we'd left hanging 50 years ago. "You look just like I remember," he said softly, eyes crinkling. I didn't know what to say. I just opened the door and tried to stand, but my knees buckled a little. Without hesitation, he offered his arm, not with pity, with grace. The kind of grace that comes from a man who's loved and lost before. "I brought water," he said, holding out a bottle like it was a precious offering, and a scarf. "You always used to get cold. Even in spring," I nodded slowly, taking them with shaking hands. He didn't ask questions, not one. Instead, he picked up my old duffel bag from the back seat like it was made of glass. He tucked the scarf around my shoulders. Then he opened the passenger door of his car and stood aside, waiting. I sat down without speaking. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, past the old part of town, through winding roads lined with trees just starting to brown at the edges. Leaves had begun to fall. It smelled like October. It smelled like endings. His house came into view slowly. 2 stories of cedar and glass, tucked beside a lake. It wasn't extravagant. It was timeless. A quiet place. A place made for someone to grow old in without being forgotten. When we pulled into the driveway, I whispered, "This is yours." He glanced at me and smiled gently. "It's ours. If you'd like it to be, I should have cried then. But something inside me was still too numb. Inside, everything smelled like clean linen and old books. There was a tea kettle on the stove, an armchair by the window with a folded quilt, a vase of fresh flowers, dahlias, my favorite. How did he remember? He led me to the guest room, but when I paused in the hallway, he didn't rush me. He just said, "Take your time." That night, I sat by the window, wrapped in that scarf, staring at the lake. I watched a duck drift by. I sipped hot tea that I hadn't made. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something close to safe. Ray didn't ask why I called after 5 decades. Didn't ask about my son, about the house, about the tremor in my hand as I clutched my mug. Because he knew. Only one thing makes a woman call her first love after 50 years. It's when there's no one else left. And somehow, he didn't need an explanation. Just presence. Just that quiet, unconditional welcome. No strings, no judgment, no expectation to smile or perform or explain my usefulness. Just, here's a room. Here's a cup of tea. Here's silence you don't have to fill. That night, I slept for 11 hours. In the morning, I woke up to birdsong and a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome home." I woke to the scent of fresh lilies and the soft rustle of lake wind brushing against linen drapes. The room was warm with sunlight, golden and quiet, the kind that didn't demand anything from you. Just existed. And for once I did too. Not as someone's mother, not as a housekeeper, not as a burden. Just me, Joanna. A woman who hadn't woken up to peace in what felt like half a lifetime. The sheets were soft, Egyptian cotton if I guessed right, and the bedside table had a glass of water with a wedge of lemon, the kind of detail you only notice when someone is paying attention. Beside it, a single rosebud in a short crystal vase. Ray had been up already. When I finally padded into the kitchen, barefoot on hardwood floors, He turned to me with the smallest, kindest smile, like I hadn't just called him out of the blue after 50 years, like this was just Tuesday. "Tea?" he asked, lifting the kettle. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. I watched as he reached for the fine bone china cups on the top shelf. How did he even remember where things were? He poured the hot water over the tea bag, waited exactly 1 minute, then added a twist of lemon peel. No sugar, just like I used to drink it when we were 17, watching ball games and whispering dreams we were too young to understand. He set the cup in front of me. I stared at it for a moment. "You remember?" He didn't look up from buttering toast. "I never forgot anything, Joe." That's when my hands started to tremble, just a little, barely noticeable. But I felt it, this ridiculous, quiet panic. The kind that comes not from fear, but from unfamiliar kindness. From someone caring when you're not sure you're worth it anymore. I hadn't had tea made for me in years. Not like this. Not with intention. With memory. With love, maybe. My spoon clinked against the porcelain as I stirred. He sat across from me, reading the paper, not trying to fill the silence, not needing anything from me. And I, Joanna, who had made 4 breakfasts a day for nearly 5 decades, who had learned to survive on half-cold coffee while packing school lunches and managing bills, had no idea what to do with a man who just let me be. I took the smallest sip of the tea. It tasted like high school afternoons and stolen kisses behind the bleachers. It tasted like the version of me I'd buried long ago. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press. I could feel his eyes occasionally flick toward me, but there was no weight in them, no judgment, no "why did you call?" or "where have you been?" Just quiet presence, the kind only time and heartbreak could teach a man to master. After breakfast, I walked out onto the deck that overlooked the lake. The air was still. The water mirrored the sky. I stood there with the cup still warm in my hands, one foot tucked slightly behind the other. I must have looked fragile, standing there like that in Ray's oversized robe and borrowed silence. But I wasn't afraid. Not of the lake. Not of being alone. And for the first time in decades, not of being loved. Because deep down, I knew something else too. Ray hadn't said it aloud, but he knew why I had called. Only one reason exists for a woman to reach back through 50 years to a man who once promised her the world. It's when she finally realizes no one else ever meant it. And maybe, just maybe, he still does. I was slicing a pear in the kitchen when the phone rang. The ringtone was faint in this house, almost too polite. I walked toward it slowly, not in a hurry. Not anymore. The caller ID said, Mason. My thumb hovered over the green icon. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. But something in me, the old mother still living under all these layers, answered. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. Not guilty, not defensive, just unsure. I didn't say anything at first, just listened. Let the silence settle. Then he asked, "Where are you?" I tilted my head, watching a white egret fly across the lake through the kitchen window. The morning sunlight danced on the water like it didn't need permission. "I'm at the home of someone who's grateful I exist," I said. He hesitated. We've been talking, me and Melissa, about everything that happened, and we realized maybe we were too harsh. Too quick, I closed my eyes. I could hear in his tone that this wasn't a true apology. This was the sound of someone realizing their safety net was gone. "You realized?" I asked gently. "That's good, Mason." Realizing is the first step, he let out a breath. "So, are you staying with someone?" "I mean, some man?" I smiled. There it was. the real reason for the call. He's not a stranger, I said calmly. He paused. But I've never met him. I rested the back of my hand against the window frame. You never asked. The silence on the other end felt dense, like he was trying to decide how much ground he'd already lost, and whether he could still take some of it back. Then he said it, quiet and a little sharp. Mom, are you sleeping with some man you barely know? I didn't flinch. No, I replied. I'm being seen by someone who's always known me. There was nothing vulgar in my tone, nothing rebellious, just truth. Mason didn't respond. I didn't need him to. I let the silence stretch, then said softly, Goodbye, Mason. And I ended the call. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, staring out at the lake. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the heaviness of letting go. A quiet shuffle behind me. I turned. Ray stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. He hadn't heard the conversation. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He just walked over, gently placed a hand on my shoulder, and gave the slightest squeeze. Not possessive, not performative, just there. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. The late afternoon sunlight poured gently through the wide window, bathing the wooden floor in a warm, amber glow. Ray had gone out for groceries, giving me a moment alone in his lakeside home, if I could even call it that. To me, it still felt like a space borrowed from a quieter, more thoughtful man. A man who didn't raise his voice. A man who remembered how I took my tea. I walked into his study, mostly out of curiosity. It was a small room, filled with books arranged neatly and a framed certificate from the fire department where he'd worked until retirement. There was an old cabinet pushed against the far wall. Something about it called to me. When I opened it, I didn't expect to find the past staring back at me. Inside, tucked beside a stack of yellowed magazines and what looked like faded letters from his late parents, was a photo album. The kind you don't just keep, you preserve. I sat down in his armchair and slowly flipped it open. The first picture caught my breath. It was from our high school reunion. I had forgotten that day entirely, but there we were. Me in a blue dress, Ray in a simple black suit, his arm hesitantly resting near my shoulder, not quite touching. We both looked lighter. Before time and responsibility carved themselves into our faces, beneath the picture was something else. A folded note, my handwriting. My throat tightened. It was the note I'd written him after that same reunion, thanking him for walking me to my car in the rain. I had written something silly at the end, something like, if I'd ever had a partner like you, maybe life would have been different. I'd written it with a smile. I never knew he'd kept it. The quiet creaked around me, almost too loud to bear. Just then, the door opened softly behind me. I turned. Ray stood in the doorway, holding a paper bag of apples and bread, looking surprised, but not upset. I didn't mean to snoop, I said quietly. He stepped in, set the bag down, and came closer. I kept everything, he said. Every note. Every smile I remembered, I looked down at the album. That was a long time ago. He nodded, and yet I remember it clearer than last Tuesday. There was a pause between us, a pause where life could have taken a turn back then. But I'd chosen a different path. I married someone else, I said softly. I had Mason. I built a life, and I never did, he replied. His voice was calm, because no one ever made me want to come home the way you did. I blinked, stunned, not because it was romantic, but because it was sincere and undeserved. I had walked away. I stared at the picture again. I made choices. I whispered. I know. I chose duty. I chose motherhood. I chose being strong. Ray nodded. And were you happy? That question settled like dust on an unused shelf in my heart. Was I? I looked away from him, out the window where the lake shimmered under fading light. A duck cut across the water's surface, alone but sure. I didn't answer, but in my silence he heard everything. Ray told me to dress nicely but not too formal. His tone was playful, but there was a glint of something else in his eyes. I didn't ask. I just chose a simple navy blouse, one that made me feel steady. The table was set on the patio, just as the sun was dipping low behind the lake. Golden light spilled across the plates, soft and forgiving. A bottle of red was already breathing, and the smell of baked rosemary chicken floated through the air. Then came the knock. Ray opened the door and greeted the man with a warm hug. Joanna, this is Thomas. Old friend, co-founder. He knows too much about me. Ray chuckled. Thomas was tall, with a quiet composure. His handshake was firm, but it was his eyes that made me pause. Sharp, but kind. Observant. I've heard more about you than you think, he said, pulling out the chair beside me, mostly through silence. I arched a brow. That's an odd way to hear about someone. He laughed. Silence tells a lot, especially when a man like Ray cancels 3 project launches in a row, starts saying things like, I'd rather be home. That's new. That's significant. I glanced at Ray, who was now pretending to check the chicken in the oven. His ears turned red. I just thought he was getting old, I said dryly. Thomas grinned. Old? Number. Just found something worth slowing down for. There was a pause, a warm one. Dinner moved slowly, stories from their corporate past, a few toasts, and light teasing. I listened more than I spoke. That's always been my rhythm. But now and then, Thomas would look at me, not as a guest, not as someone being assessed, but as someone already understood. He refilled my glass once and said quietly, If you're the reason Ray's choosing to stay home and make roast chicken, then I think we finally found his balance. It landed softly in the space between us. Me? The reason someone wanted to come home? I hadn't been that for anyone in decades. After dessert, warm pear crumble and a scoop of vanilla, Thomas stood up, gave Ray a knowing pat on the back, and said to me, He's better with you around. Don't tell him I said that. When he left, the patio grew still again. The crickets picked up where the conversation left off. Ray poured us each a last inch of wine. Then he turned to me with a steadiness that made me hold my breath. I have a house, he said. Behind the lake. Smaller than this. Cozy. Just enough space for rose bushes and a reading chair. I tilted my head. Is this the part where you suggest I go check it out? He nodded. Tomorrow, if you like it, it's yours. I'll have the papers ready by noon. I blinked. You mean, sign it over to me? Yes, in your name. No strings, just a place that's yours. I stared at him for a moment. The man I once knew only in letters and hallway glances, now offering me land and shelter and something dangerously close to home. I'm not someone who's used to being offered things, I said slowly. Ray took a sip of wine. Maybe it's time someone did. There was no pressure in his voice, no urgency, just quiet intention. And I realized the world hadn't changed, but someone in it had remembered how to see me. And maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to remember too. When Ray handed me the keys to the lake house, I stood there, staring at them in my palm. Silver. Ordinary. But my fingers trembled like they were made of glass. He didn't say anything dramatic. Just, it's yours if you want it. No strings, no promises, no pressure. Just a choice I didn't expect to be offered again at 68. I walked into the house the next morning. The air was still, the kind that carries a silence only broken by soft wood creaking under familiar feet. I traced the frame of the kitchen door with my hand. The scent of pine hung faintly in the corners. It reminded me of Ray's cologne back in college. Faint, safe, honest. I unpacked slowly. A cup, a kettle, one chair. The keys lay on the counter. That night, I brewed myself a single cup of tea. No sugar, just heat. Steam curled up like a sigh I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Then I sat down and reached for the letter I knew I had to write. The letter to my son. Not to ask for anything. Not anymore. Just to say what needed saying, without expectation of reply. Mason, I'm not writing to blame you. This isn't a letter filled with what-ifs or demands or even sadness. Not today. I just wanted to tell you, I'm done knocking. I don't say that to punish you. I say it because I need to stop waiting at a door that no longer opens. You don't owe me anything. You never did. Not really. Love, after all, isn't a transaction. I know that now. Still, when I handed over everything, the house, the account, the part of myself I'd kept buried under I understand and it's okay, I had hoped you'd see me as more than an obligation. But I'm not angry, and I'm not bitter. You see, I've remembered who I was before I became just mom, before I was the woman who waited at windows and answered texts with, "Of course." This morning, I signed something, a legal document. The copy's enclosed. You'll notice the void stamp. I thought you'd appreciate that part. No one's coming after you. I don't want the money back. I don't want anything at all, really, except maybe peace. And I have it now. So this letter, it isn't a bridge, Mason. It's a shoreline. If you ever want to swim back, you can. But I won't be shouting across the waves anymore. Take care of yourself. And if you ever wonder, yes, I still love you. But I love me too. Mom? I folded the letter carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it mattered. Beside the envelope, I placed a black and white photocopy of the $620,000 property transfer. Across it, in bold red, the legal stamp read, void. I didn't smile, not out of regret, just acceptance. Then, without thinking, I reached for something I hadn't touched in decades. The old linen handkerchief with my initials embroidered in the corner. J.W. Joanna Whitmore. Not Mom. Not Mrs. Langford. Not the woman who quietly gave until she disappeared. Just me. I folded it once, twice, then tucked it into the envelope beside the letter. No perfume, no photos, no guilt. Just the truth, sealed without weight. I placed the envelope on the table. Tomorrow I'd mail it. But for now, it sat beside my tea, quiet, calm, and done. I picked up the keys again. This time, my hands didn't shake. The morning light streamed across the lake like soft silk, quiet and gentle. I sat on the porch with my cardigan wrapped around my shoulders, the cup of chamomile tea cooling slowly in my hands. The house Ray had given me had a stillness I was learning to breathe into. It didn't echo like my old one. It embraced. It listened. And today, I needed that more than ever. Thomas arrived just past 10, wearing that same wide-brimmed hat he always did, the one with the faint stain from an old wine spill he never cared to clean. We sat under the awning, facing the water, with a plate of lemon scones between us that neither of us touched for a while. He didn't ask why I'd called him over. I appreciated that about Thomas. He always knew when silence needed room to walk around before words could sit down. I wrote him a letter, I said finally, tracing the edge of my teacup with my finger. Mason, no blame, no request, just a goodbye that he doesn't even have to open. Thomas didn't respond at first. He let my words settle, like dust on a quiet bookshelf. You know, he said slowly, 6 years ago, My son walked out. No warning, no fight, just silence. I turned toward him. He rarely spoke of his children. He came back last fall. He continued, his voice low. Not to apologize, not to reconnect, just to ask if I'd updated my will. Wanted to know what he'd get. I winced. Thomas. He waved his hand gently, brushing away my pity. It shocked me less than I thought it would. You spend enough time in the quiet, Joanna, and you start hearing truths even when people don't speak them. I looked down at my lap. My fingers had been fidgeting with the old handkerchief again. JW embroidered in the corner, thread frayed from years of being folded and unfolded. What did you say to him? I asked softly. Thomas gave a tired smile. I said I already left him everything he ever needed. If he didn't see it, maybe he never will. My throat tightened. I keep thinking, I said. Was I too soft? Did I fail Mason by loving him more than he deserved? Or did I break something in him by not holding him accountable sooner? Thomas leaned back, his chair creaking. That's the curse of parenthood, Joe. We think love means making sure they never fall, but maybe sometimes love means letting them fall and not running to catch them. I stared out over the lake, the surface shimmering like glass. Ray thinks I should just let it go, that some things don't deserve to be revisited. Ray's not wrong, Thomas replied, but he's not you, and you have to decide what kind of silence you can live with. The silence of letting go, or the silence of hoping they come back and never do. His words landed like a pebble in the stillness, not loud, but deep. I thought about the transfer paper with the word void scrawled across it. Thought about the letter I'd mailed yesterday morning, one last folded kindness. Not to buy redemption, not even to remind Mason of the money, but to say, I'm not at your door anymore, son. I'm not knocking, and I won't be waiting on the porch. But even as I told myself it was the right thing, a quiet ache lived beneath my ribs. Because motherhood doesn't dissolve with disappointment. It just learns to hold its breath a little longer. Do you think family has a limit? I asked, still not looking at Thomas. He didn't answer, not with words, but I felt the weight of his silence, the way his hands clasped together, the way he closed his eyes for a moment too long. I turned back to the lake, my fingers still gently mending that handkerchief's loose thread. There was no answer today, and maybe there wouldn't be tomorrow either. But for now, I sat in the quiet. Not the kind that begs for someone to speak, but the kind that finally starts to feel like peace. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded neatly in an envelope addressed in Lena's cursive. No stamps, just hand-delivered to my front porch, probably by one of the boys from next door, bribed with a chocolate bar or a, "Thank you, sweetie." I stared at it for a long time before I touched it. My name, Joanna, written in blue ink, soft but too deliberate. I knew it wasn't Mason's handwriting. He hadn't written me anything since the birthday card Brenda forged on his behalf 3 years ago. Inside was a card with a watercolor print of peonies. Cheap stock, generic. Inside, her message read, Joanna, we'd like to talk. If you're open, it's time. Please come by Sunday at 4, just the 3 of us. I owe you a real explanation. Lena. No dear, no love, no sincerely. Just those words, like placing a Band-Aid on a wound that had never stopped bleeding. I folded the card back and set it on the counter. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. But I didn't plan to go either. There was nothing they could say that I hadn't already read between the silences and half-truths. Nothing that could uncrack the voice in Mason when he said, "You just drain people," or make me forget the way Lena clutched her handbag tighter when I walked into the same room. I went about my day, pruning my roses, folding the last of the laundry, wiping down the oak table in the dining room. Every so often, My eyes drifted toward the card. I didn't open it again. That evening, Ray stopped by. He didn't knock. He never had to. After all these years, he still had a key. Not because I gave it, but because I never asked for it back. He let himself in, carrying 2 steaming containers of lentil soup and fresh baguette from the deli on Main. No fanfare, just placed them gently on the table. "I saw your porch," he said. "That envelope was still there this morning." "You looked?" "I always look," he said simply. Old habits. I sat across from him, sipping the soup even though I wasn't hungry. He waited a while before saying anything else, as if allowing the air between us to settle first. "She wants you to come?" he asked. "Sunday," I said. 4:00. He nodded. "Are you going?" I shook my head. "No point." "I know how it ends." "I don't think it's about how it ends," Ray said. "I think maybe it's about how you stop letting it live rent-free in your chest." I looked up at him. "You think I'm clinging?" "I think," he said, "you're still hoping they'll become someone else. And maybe seeing them for who they truly are is the only way to let them go." The words stung more than I expected, because he wasn't cruel when he said them. He was right. There was still a part of me that hoped Mason would blink and suddenly remember the afternoons I waited in emergency rooms when he scraped his knees. That he'd recall the years I patched together tuition and therapy and his father's debts. That he'd sit me down and say, "Mom, I was wrong. I see you now." But those fantasies, they were stitched from desperation, not reality. "You'll go with me?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Ray didn't flinch. He just reached for the last piece of baguette and said, "Of course. But not for them. You're not going to prove anything to anyone. You're going for you. So you can finally stop wishing they were different." I swallowed hard. The soup had gone cold. I placed the spoon down and exhaled through my nose. "You always did know how to corner me gently," I said. He smiled. Not smug, just familiar. "Well, someone has to keep you from disappearing behind your pride." I gave a small nod. "Sunday, then." Ray reached across the table and tapped my knuckles lightly. "Sunday." That night, as I washed the dishes, I noticed how steady my hands were. No trembling, no second-guessing, just stillness. And maybe that was the first sign I was finally choosing myself. Ray pulled the car to a stop at the curb. My fingers clenched the leather handle of my purse, knuckles pale against the navy fabric. The house was familiar, but only in blueprint. My money had built it, but my heart had never lived here. The door opened before we reached the porch. Lena stood there, crisp white blouse, makeup just a touch too polished. She blinked twice when she saw Ray beside me. "Oh," she said, her voice too bright. "You came." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight with things I wouldn't allow to spill. Ray gave her a nod that wasn't exactly friendly. "Afternoon." She stepped aside. "Mason's inside. He just got back from work. We thought maybe we could talk. Clear the air." The air, I thought, had been fouled long before this. We stepped into the foyer, cool, spotless, staged like a catalog. I recognized the mahogany console table. It had been my birthday gift to myself once, years ago. Now it sat here like it belonged to someone else. Mason appeared from the hallway. He looked tired, older than his 38 years, but when he saw us, a small, forced smile tugged at his lips. His eyes flickered to Ray, then to me. "Hey, Mom," he said, voice cautious. We talked about it, and we realized maybe we didn't handle things the best way. So we thought, maybe you could stay here." For a while, he gestured toward the guest room hallway like it was a grand offering. I should have felt grateful, but all I felt was a dull thud behind my ribs. I opened my mouth, but Ray beat me to it. He stepped forward, hand extended. "That's generous of you," Ray said, "especially since I hear this is the house your mother paid for." Mason froze. The smile vanished from his face. He didn't shake Ray's hand, just stood there like someone had pulled a string and disconnected his posture from his pride. Lena's mouth opened slightly. Her eyes darted to Mason. Ray turned to me then, not with malice, not even judgment, just calm clarity. He held out his hand to me again. And then, with a softness that carried more weight than any shouted word, he said, "We're going home." Silence, thick, tangible, like someone had vacuumed the air out of the room. I felt my breath catch, and then settle. I nodded, quietly. My feet moved on their own. We turned, the click of my heels echoing like punctuation. Behind us, neither Mason nor Lena said a word. Not a plea, not an apology. Just silence. But it was loud enough for me to finally hear myself think. Ray opened the car door for me, and as I sat down, I realized something. I had come not for them, not even for closure. I had come to see, for the last time, that who they were was no longer who I was waiting for. We drove away without a backward glance. Some doors don't need to be slammed to be shut. As Ray and I stepped onto the front porch, the door behind us opened again. "Mom, wait," Lena's voice called out, quieter now. I paused without turning. She walked up beside me, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if bracing herself against a gust of wind that hadn't come yet. "I just wanted to say," she murmured, glancing back to make sure no one was watching. "You can think whatever you want about how things have gone, but Mason and we're not doing this out of cruelty. We don't want to be controlled." Her voice wavered, but the word controlled landed sharp, as if it had been rehearsed. As if she'd used it before, many times, in private. Controlled. That was what they told themselves, wasn't it? That giving me the smallest room in the house I helped fund was some act of freedom? That not inviting me to the Thanksgiving table was a boundary? I turned toward her, slowly. "I never asked for control," I said gently. "I never even asked for repayment. All I ever wanted was to walk into a home I helped build, and not feel like a burden the moment I crossed the threshold." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She didn't answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Behind her, the living room light was casting shadows through the door frame. From this angle, I could see the staircase, the hallway, the same kitchen where I used to bake pies with Mason as a little boy. That house had known laughter once. Mine, his, even hers maybe, in earlier days. But something had changed. And now, standing under this dim porch light, I saw it clearly. She wasn't just a daughter-in-law trying to keep her space. She was the reflection of who I used to be. Once upon a time, I'd stood in a different doorway, telling my own mother that we needed room to build our lives, that we'd visit soon, that it's not personal. I had believed I was right then, that youth and new beginnings gave me license to prioritize, to organize love like items on a shelf, deciding which ones to dust off and which to box away. And yet, the difference between Lena and me was that I had never accepted a single cent from my mother. She gave me what little she had: wisdom, recipes, stories, and quiet understanding. And still, I had made her wait by the phone on holidays, just like I had waited now. Lena turned to go back inside, but for a second I caught her expression. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't triumphant. It was scared. Because she knew. She knew I hadn't yelled. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't said a word inside that house that could be used against me. But she had heard Ray. I heard this was the house his mother paid for. 6 words that had turned Mason's face pale. 6 words that had shifted the air like a thunderclap. And then, the softest words of all, spoken just for me. "We're going home." She paused in the doorway, just long enough to whisper, "I know you loved him." Mason. That's why this hurt so much I didn't respond. There was nothing else to say. I had already buried the pain beneath the years of sacrifice, and now I was done digging it up to make others comfortable. "I did," I finally said, "but love doesn't mean staying where you're unwelcome." She hesitated again, then nodded, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. And as the door latched, so did something in my chest. A quiet closure. Ray was waiting by the car. He didn't ask what Lena had said. He just opened the passenger side door and held out his hand. "You okay?" he asked. I took one last glance at the house. My name never on the deed, but my hands all over the foundation. Then I took his hand and said, "Let's go home." He smiled. Not the big, showy kind, but the quiet kind that wraps around you like a wool blanket in winter. We drove off, without music. No need to fill the silence. It was full enough with everything unspoken. In the side mirror, the house grew smaller. But in my heart, something else was growing. Not bitterness, not even grief. Just space. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't holding on to anyone who didn't want to be held. And that was freedom. The morning light came in soft, not like the cold glare of days I used to dread. It touched everything in the room gently, warming the corners of the window panes, and resting on the quiet folds of the cream curtains Ray had insisted we keep. "They look like hope," he'd said when we unpacked. I walked barefoot across the wooden floor of our new house. My house. Not borrowed, not tolerated, not where I had to earn a place at the table. Just home. The air smelled faintly of tea leaves and jasmine. Outside, someone was watering their garden. I heard the soft hiss of the hose and the distant bark of a dog greeting the morning. The world wasn't loud here. It didn't need to be. It just existed in peace. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was existing too, not just surviving. Ray had already left for the store. He said he'd be gone for just a bit. "Something's missing from this place," he smiled. I'd rolled my eyes, but deep down, I trusted whatever he was about to bring back. Ray never promised magic. He just made space for it. I moved into the kitchen. There, on the little pinewood table by the window, was something he'd left. A small glass vase, no larger than a mason jar, with wildflowers arranged clumsily but beautifully. Daisies, a sprig of lavender, something soft and pale blue I didn't recognize. And beside it, a worn leather notebook with a silver pen tucked into its spine. There was a note folded underneath. "If you ever feel like writing again, I thought you might like a fresh start." I didn't read the old ones, but I saved them, just in case you want them back one day. R. My throat tightened. He had seen me, the old me, the version that used to write down everything because it was the only way I knew how to speak without shaking. And he hadn't tried to fix me. He'd just made room. I sat down slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the notebook. Then I stood up again. There was something I needed to do first. I walked to the cabinet where I'd placed the things I hadn't yet dared to touch since we moved in. From the very back, I pulled out the box wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was the old teacup, porcelain, hand-painted, cracked along the edge from that time Mason accidentally knocked it over as a child. I'd kept it anyway. And next to it, the linen handkerchief with my initials embroidered, J.W. a gift from my sister before she passed. I boiled water, not rushed, not distracted, just present. When the kettle sang, I poured the hot water over the Earl Grey leaves and let them steep. The scent rose like memory. I folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it on the table, setting the cup gently on top, as if anchoring myself back into a body I was finally learning to love again. I took the first sip with closed eyes. The bitterness was gone. For years, tea had tasted like disappointment, like holidays passed in silence, like canceled calls, like waiting in my own house for a son who had once called me home, but now asked me to stay away. But today, the same tea tasted different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Ray called it healing. I just called it returning. The sun stretched further across the table now, warming my forearms as I sat in silence. There were no phones buzzing, no sharp words lingering in the air, no one watching me like I didn't belong. And for the first time in a long time, I reached for the notebook. I didn't know what I'd write. Maybe just a line. Maybe a story. Maybe just a thought. I'm still here. And that matters. But before the ink touched the page, I paused. I looked around, at the flowers, the sunlight, the old cup with its crack, the steady breath of morning that didn't demand anything of me. I smiled. This was mine, not because I'd fought for it, or paid for it, or earned it, but because I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell me I could have it. And as I looked down at that steaming cup resting on the JW cloth, I whispered to myself, not as a vow, but as a truth that had taken decades to settle in. I'm home, even if no one else ever says it. I know it now, and that is enough. That afternoon, we sat outside on the back porch, the lake just beyond us, glittering under the early autumn sun. The air was cool, but kind, the kind that makes you breathe deeper without realizing it. I was wrapped in the shawl Ray had brought out for me, sipping tea, the silence between us comfortable and familiar. He had something in his hands, a photo maybe, folded and worn with time, but he didn't offer it yet. Instead, he looked at the lake, eyes following the gentle ripple of water catching light. You remember that summer after high school, he said finally, when we used to sit by the edge of Holston Lake right where the cattails grew tall. I smiled. You used to skip rocks. I tried and failed miserably. You got better. Only after I gave up trying to look graceful doing it. He chuckled, and then fell quiet again. The silence wasn't heavy. It was building to something. I felt it, like a wave swelling far from shore. I never told you why I left for college without saying goodbye properly, he said, almost in a whisper. I looked at him. I thought it was because you couldn't. No? He turned to me. It was because I thought if I said goodbye right, I wouldn't leave at all. My breath caught. I loved you back then, he continued. I knew it. But I also knew I had to build something for myself first, something worthy. So I left. I told myself I'd come back after graduation. When I had a ring and a plan, I didn't say anything. My heart thudded, not painfully, but with that strange ache that comes from years you can't go back to. He pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to me. It wasn't a photo. It was an old survey map, worn at the edges. He pointed to a small shaded rectangle just off the lake road. I bought this the week after I graduated, he said. It's not much, just a bit of land. But it's where we always said we'd build a house, remember? I looked at the map. I didn't know what to say. It was right there, Lot 17B. My breath faltered. I came back, he said, but you had already married. I closed my eyes for a second. I stood by the church that day. he went on, voice soft but steady. I watched you walk out with your new husband. You looked so happy. I didn't think I had any right. You never told me, I said, barely more than a whisper. I couldn't. What would I have said? That I was too late? That I'd come back with a piece of land and a promise? But you never sold it, I asked, still staring at the map. Never, he said. I held on to it all these years. It was never about the land. It was a piece of a life I had imagined. I just couldn't let it go. I touched the map gently. Ray, you don't need to say anything, he said. I'm not telling you this to make you feel anything other than what you already do. I just thought you deserved to know that this place, this home, was part of a dream once. A dream that didn't come true when I thought it would. But maybe it came true in its own way. I was silent for a long while. The porch creaked slightly under my chair. The wind picked up and swept a dry maple leaf across the floorboards. I looked out at the lake, the same lake where we once laughed as teenagers. And now, decades later, I was sitting here again, not with regret, not with longing, just presence, stillness. He added softly, You don't have to believe in destiny, Joanna. I know you never really did, I turned to him. But you're living in a part of it, he said, right now. And I believed him, not because the stars had aligned or because fate had twisted the world to fit us back together, but because of something quieter, deeper. A thread that had never fully snapped, even when the years had frayed it thin. I looked at the land he'd kept, the home we were sitting in, the tea in my hand, the man beside me. 46 years, I said quietly. He nodded. That's a long time to hold on to something. His voice barely cracked when he replied, Some things are worth it. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't about what could have been. It was about what was finally allowed to be. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains. I had opened the windows wide, letting in the cool air and the sound of finches chirping on the fence. There was no rush, no tension sitting beneath my skin. I sat at the kitchen table, the steam from my tea curling upward like a quiet ribbon. Ray had gone into town for groceries. He said he wanted to pick up the honey I liked, the one with the orange blossom. It was such a small thing, but it still made something soften inside me. I reached for the notebook he'd left for me days ago. I hadn't written anything in it yet, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't quite know what I wanted to say. But this morning I did. I opened to the first page. The paper was crisp, untouched. I picked up my pen and sat with the silence for a while. Then slowly, I began to write. Mason, this isn't a letter I'm sending, and I don't expect you to ever read it. But I need to write it anyway. I want you to know I forgive you. Not because what you did didn't hurt. It did. More than I ever imagined possible. Not because it was justified, because it never was. I forgive you because I'm done carrying the weight of it. You don't owe me an explanation. Not anymore. I've stopped. Needing reasons from people who never tried to understand mine. If someday you come looking for me, not to explain, not to apologize, but simply to see me, then bring your eyes wide open. Not your pride, not your stories, just you. And maybe then we'll talk, but not today. Mom. I set the pen down. My hand rested on the page for a moment. The ink was still drying, glistening faintly in the light. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. I carefully closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer beside the table. Ray had put a felt lining in there last week. He thought it would be nice for keepsakes. I smiled at that. Then I reached into my coat pocket. The old handkerchief was there, like always. Folded neatly, monogrammed JW, edges slightly frayed. It had been in my purse, my pocket, or my nightstand every day since Mason left for college. It had seen courtrooms, hospitals, birthdays, betrayals. It had soaked up silent tears and held mints for nervous conversations. I unfolded it one last time, pressed it flat on the table, then refolded it just so. This time, I didn't tuck it back into my pocket. Instead, I opened the drawer again, placed it gently on top of the notebook, and closed the drawer softly. Not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but because it was time. I walked to the window. The lake shimmered beyond the trees, and the rose bushes Ray planted had bloomed again, soft petals and deep red, heavy with dew. For the first time in years, I felt something still and centered in me. Not an ache, not an echo, just a quiet kind of peace. I sipped my tea slowly and let it stay warm all the way to the bottom of the cup. The chair creaked just enough to remind me it was real. Not an antique, not a showpiece, just a weathered seat nestled on the small balcony that caught the softest light of morning. The roses had started blooming again. I hadn't expected them to, honestly. Not this soon. Not after what they had been through last winter. But here they were, pink and defiant, reaching for the sun without apology. I sipped my tea, still hot, the ceramic warm against my palms. It used to go cold, sitting forgotten beside unopened letters or dinner that had gone untouched because someone hadn't called, or had called to say I wasn't needed. I used to drink it standing up, mid-task, mid-sacrifice, mid-disappointment. But today, I sat, still, present, no one else's need at the center of my morning. A beam of sunlight slipped through the railing and landed right on the hem of my robe, golden and delicate. I didn't move, didn't reach for a phone or a chore, just breathed. The silence wasn't empty, it was enough. From inside, I heard his voice, soft, still gravelly after sleep. "What are we thinking for lunch today, Joe?" Ray, always asking like it was a partnership, like I had a say in something more than just the menu. I smiled into the rim of my mug before answering. "I'm thinking, something that used to feel like a luxury," I said, turning my head slightly so he could hear. "Peace." I heard him chuckle, then the sound of a cabinet door closing. "You always were impossible to cook for," he teased. I didn't reply. I just smiled to myself. The wind stirred the lace curtain behind me. It was the same curtain I used to iron twice a month, obsessed with creases that no one ever noticed. Now it fluttered freely, a little wrinkled, a little sun-worn, and perfect. My phone buzzed gently on the side table. I reached for it and saw Brenda's name flashing across the screen. I hadn't seen her since the community fundraiser last month, the one where she'd shown up with a broken heel and too much red lipstick, declaring that growing old was just a marketing scam. The message read, "Joe, the foundation just signed another contract. You still got time to celebrate with us?" I could almost hear her voice, gritty, tired, but somehow always vibrant. I placed my mug down, picked up the phone, and typed slowly. No rush, no obligation, just truth. I live now. I don't just exist. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, letting the morning wrap itself around me. I thought of everything that had once occupied this hour of the day. Running, pleasing, stretching myself thin to fit molds others handed me. I thought of the handkerchief that had traveled with me through every season of heartbreak and duty. It sat now in the drawer by the hallway table. I hadn't brought it out this morning, for the first time in years, decades perhaps. I didn't need it anymore. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind. A few birds argued in the trees. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed. In another life, that noise would have irritated me, disrupted my chain of thought or my long list of worries. Today, It just meant someone else was tending to their patch of earth. It meant I wasn't alone in choosing to stay, to build, quietly, to heal. Ray came out onto the balcony, holding a small plate with 2 slices of avocado toast, his latest obsession. "Is this peaceful enough?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he placed it down next to me. I laughed, the sound surprising even myself. "Almost," I said. "Needs a side of quiet defiance." He looked at me like he didn't quite understand, but loved me enough not to question it. I took a bite. It wasn't the best toast I'd ever had, but it was mine, in my space, on my terms, with someone who stayed because he saw me, not as a mother, a provider, a burden, but as Joanna, just Joanna. As he turned to go back inside, I looked once more at the roses. A few petals had already started to brown at the edges. Imperfect, alive, honest. I brought the cup back to my lips, still warm, still mine. And as the morning wore on, and the sun made its quiet climb, I felt no urge to be anywhere else, to perform, to be useful, to be forgiven, to be invited. I had made it back to myself. So I ask you, whoever you are, listening to this voice from a porch where the roses bloom again, do you think I was too harsh? Or did I, perhaps, just finally come home to myself?